everyone, welcome back. We are on, goodness, the last few days of school. Friday is our official last day, but for us, my class, Thursday will be our last office hours at 2 o'clock. If so, I am going to, if we don't finish the book by the end of the week on Friday, I'm going to keep uploading Read Aloud starting next week to finish the book on my YouTube, but Teams will be shut down. So after this week, starting next week, just on YouTube, you can find me there. They do Read Alouds. Da, 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 da. So let's finish this book together. It's been quite a roller coaster. Today we are reading chapters 32, 33, and 34, starting with Isabel's story. When we left off, Isabel, let's see. Oh, they had just pulled into the Bahamas, and they learned they can't stay. They can't even get off the boat, and a bunch of people from the Bahamas, tourists and people that live there, started bringing them a bunch of stuff, including medicine for the mom, because the mom, who's pregnant, is feeling very sick. Isabel, somewhere between the Bahamas and Florida, 1994, 4 days from home. The little boat was falling apart. The seams between the sides had cracks in them. The engine rattled in its mounting, constantly weakening the bolts that had held it in place. Even the benches were coming loose. Only Castro had it cracked. He stared up at Isabel, as stern and confident as ever, commanding her to fight against the impossible and win. It was all caps, so that's why I said it like that. But it was hard to fight against the inevitable. The water in the boat was almost to Isabel's knees. She and the others worked sluggishly in the blazing hot Caribbean sun to scoop, pitch, but water was seeping in as fast as they could bail it. The boat was sinking. Every empty water bottle and gasoline had been tucked under a bench to help them keep afloat. But if they didn't reach Florida soon, they were all going to drown. Fight against the impossible and win, Isabel told herself. When are we going to get there? Ivan whined. Mañana, Lido said wearily. Mañana. Suddenly, Isabel's grandfather stopped bailing water. He sat up straighter like he was looking at something in the distance. Mañana, he whispered. Lido? Isabel asked. Her grandfather blinked and his eyes found her again. Was he crying or was it just sweat and seawater? It's nothing, Chabela, just a memory. Something I haven't had to think about in a long time. Isabel's grandfather gazed around the little boat, and his eyes suddenly looked sadder, Isabel thought. She would have crawled over and hugged him, but there was no room to do it without 3 people getting up and moving for her to get there. Don't stop bailing, Senor Castillo told them from where he lay at the bottom of the boat. Maybe you could help, Papi told him. I'm recovering, Senor Castillo argued. I can barely move in this heat. Besides, I don't see you bailing. I'm tending to my wife, Papi said, who's really sick. Ever since the Bahamas, something had come over Isabel's father. He had been more attentive to Mommy, more focused on her than anything else. Nobody else noticed, but Isabella did. She had seen him hold her hand, watched him gently move her hair out of her face, heard him whisper that he loved her, that he needed her. Things she had never seen or heard him do before. Are you saying my father is faking it? Louise challenged. I'm just saying it's very nice for him that everybody else is keeping this metal coffin afloat while he sits back and relaxes, Papi said. You wouldn't even have this metal coffin if I hadn't built it. I'm not sure if built is the right word, Senor Castillo said, trying to pull 2 of the side pieces back together. Cobbled is more like it. Ivan and Senor Castillo erupted at the same time. We did the best we could, Ivan yelled. Oh, now you're telling us how to build things, Senor Castillo said. Where were you and Luis when we were up all night putting this thing together, eh? You were at your law office doing God knows what. Isabella shrank in her seat and put her hands over her ears. She hated when her parents argued like this, and now everyone on the boat was mad at each other. I was helping people, Senora Castillo told her husband. You never appreciated what I do. And what was I supposed to do, Luis threw in. Tell my police commander I had to stay home and build a boat so that I could escape? All of you, stop it, Amara yelled from the back of the boat. Right now, you're acting like children. Everybody fell quiet and looked appropriately chastised. I think it's time for a water break, Amara told them. Isabel, would you hand out the bottles? It was a little earlier than their rationed water break, but none of them complained. It was clear, delicious water was the best thing Isabel had ever tasted, and it settled them down like mother's milk for a baby. We're all hot and we're all tired, and yes, we're sinking, Amara said, but if we lose our heads, we're only going to die faster. We can resolve this. She's right, Isabella's father said. I'm sorry. I'm sorry too, Senor Castillo said. I should be helping. Only if you're up for it, Papi said, and he sounded like he meant it. The boat is falling apart, though, Ivan said, and we're taking on too much water. We have too much weight, Senora Castillo said. She was right, but what could they lose? There was just the engine, the fuel, the food, the water, and the 9 of them. What if 1 or 2 of us slipped out into the water at a time, Papi suggested. They could hang on to the boat. Floating in the alongside the water would help take some of the weight away. But it would drag on the boat and slow us down, Luis said. But it might keep the boat afloat longer, Senora Castillo said. I think we should try it, Amara said. We'll take turns in the water. It will help us keep cooler, too. And right now, Isabella thought cooler heads just might be the most important thing at all. All right. So we are now on Mehmood's story. When we left Mehmood, he had just got a life preserver on his mother, and they are in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, just trying to survive every second. The dad and Walid is gone. Hana, the baby, is with strangers on a boat somewhere, and they are feeling very weak and defeated. Mehmood, somewhere on the Mediterranean Sea, 2015, 11 days from home. Mehmood was in and out of sleep, waking every few seconds when the waves washed over him. Minutes, hours passed, and Mehmood dreamed that a boat was coming for them. He could hear its motor over the lapping of the waves. Mehmood jerked awake. He ran a wet, cold hand down his face, trying to focus. But he heard it again, the sound of a motor. He wasn't dreaming. But where was it? The rain had stopped, but it was still dark. He couldn't see the boat, but he could hear it. Here, he cried, here! But the sound of the motor still stayed furiously, frustratingly, agonizing, far away. It was only whoever that was on the boat could see him, Mehmood thought. All his life he had practiced being hidden, unnoticed. Now at last, when he needed to be seen, he was truly invisible. Mehmood cried in exhaustion and misery. He wanted to do it all over again. He wanted to go back and stand up for the boy in the alley in Aleppo who was getting beat up for his bread, to scream and yell and wake the sleeping citizens of Izmir so that they can see him and all the other people sleeping in doorways and parks, to tell Bashar al-Assad and his army to go to hell. He wanted to stop being invisible and stand up and fight, but now he would never get a chance to do any of it. It was too late and there was no time. Time! The phone! Mehmood still had the phone in his pocket. He pulled it out and pushed the button on it through a plastic bag, and the screen with the clock on it lit like a beacon in the night. Mehmood held it over his head and waved it in the dark, yelling and screaming for help. The motor got louder. Mehmood wept for joy as the boat emerged from the darkness. A real boat this time, not a dinghy. A speedboat with lights and antennas and blue and white stripes on the side, the colors of the Greek flag. Thank God. A Greek Coast Guard ship come to save them, and then the front of the ship, down on his knees, oh no, oh my God, yay! And on the front of the ship, down on his knees, with his hands clasped in thanks, was Mehmood's father. Oh yes! Waleed was there too in the back under a foil thermal blanket, and soon Mehmood and his mother were out of the water and wrapped in the foil blankets too, with little body heat they still had reflected back at them. Mehmood's mother was too insensible to speak, so Mehmood told his father how they had given Hana away rather than see her drown with them. Mehmood's father wept, but he pulled Mehmood to him and hugged him. Hana's not with us, but she's alive. I know it, his father told him, because of you, my son. The Greek Coast Guard boat swept through the choppy Mediterranean Sea the rest of the night, pulling more people out of the water. The Coast Guard finally set Mehmood and his family and all the other refugees down on the island of Lesbos. It was almost 6 o'clock in the morning, and the sky was beginning to lighten with the dawn. Mehmood wasn't sure, but he thought he and his mother had spent more than 2 hours in the water. When they stepped off the boat, Mehmood's father got down on his hands and knees and kissed the ground and gave thanks to Allah. It was time for morning prayers anyways, and Mehmood joined him. When they were finished, Mehmood staggered up the rocky gray shore, squinting at the hills, and rose just beyond the beach. Then he realized they weren't real hills. They were piles and piles of life jackets. There were mountains of them, stretching up and down the coast as far as Mehmood could see. The way Aleppo had piles of rubble, Lesbos has piles of life jackets abandoned by the hundreds of thousands of refugees who had come before them, shedding the vest they no longer needed and moving along the road to somewhere else. There were bodies on the beach, too, people who hadn't survived the sea in the night, who had been found by the Coast Guard in time. Men mostly, but a few women, too, and a child. Mehmood's mother rushed to the infant, howling Hana's name. Mehmood hurried after her, horrified, but the child wasn't Hana. It was someone else's baby daughter, her lungs filled with seawater. Mehmood's mother cried on his shoulders, until a Greek man in uniform moved them both away from the body and recorded the infant in a little notebook, tallying the daily dead. Mehmood staggered away, feeling numb, as if he were in the freezing water again. Mehmood's mother went to all the other refugees who had landed in the night and who were still there, asking them if they had seen her little Hana, but none of them had. The boat with Mehmood's little sister on it was gone too. It had either reached the island and its passengers had moved on, or it too had wrecked on the rocks. Mehmood's mother fell to her knees on the rocky ground and wept, and Mehmood's father held her close and let her cry. Mehmood felt gutted. It was all of his fault. Hana might still be with them if he hadn't gotten someone on that boat to take her, or she might have died during their 2 hours in the water. Either way, they had lost her. Mehmood, his father said quietly over the sobbing mother, check the other bodies and see if they have any shoes that will fit us. All right, last chapter of the day, we're returning to Joseph. When we left Joseph, his father had just been rescued from diving over the sea. And Joseph had just realized that his father wanted to commit suicide. And Joseph was so worried, and he realized that his father had never truly came back from the concentration camp. And Joseph is so worried because he knows they won't let him and his family into Cuba now, and he has no clue what's going to happen to him. Joseph, just outside Havana Harbor, 1939, 19 days from home. Joseph wished he was invisible. Invisible is a common theme in this book. Once the rest of the passengers discovered who had jumped overboard yesterday, everyone stopped to tell him how sorry they were, how everything would be all right. But how could it be all right? How could it ever be all right? Joseph stood at the rail on the A deck where his father had jumped. Down below, the sea was no longer empty. It was dotted with the little motorboats and rowboats. Some carried reporters shouting up questions and trying to get pictures of the ship. Other boats offered bunches of fresh bananas and bags of coconuts and oranges. Passengers on C deck tossed money down, and the fruit was passed up by the ladder by the Cuban police guarding the top and bottom. Lately, though, the boats were full of relatives of people on board, mostly men who had come ahead to Cuba to get jobs and find places for their families to live. One man had brought the same little white dog every day and held him up for his wife to wave to. The boats with relatives came close enough for their families to yell back and forth a little, but they couldn't get any closer. Thanks to Joseph's father, a handful of Cuban police boats now surrounded the St. Louis. They kept the rescue ships at a distance and watched for anybody who tried to jump to freedom or death. At night, the Cuban police boats swept the hull with searchlights, and the St. Louis crew members, and on the captain's order, patrolled the decks on suicide watch. "Evelyn, there he is! There's Papa!" Renata cried. She stood a few paces away from Joseph, down the rail, trying to point out one of the little rowboats to her sister. "Where? I don't see him," Evelyn whined. Joseph was more interested in the small police boats that had not navigated its way through the flotilla and was pulling up to the St. Louis. Any time they had a visitor now, it was cause for conversation, and soon word spread throughout the ship that the boat had brought the Cuban policeman who had saved Joseph's father. Joseph ran down to fetch his mother and his sister, and together they hurried to the social hall, where a group of passengers and crew gathered to give the Cuban policeman a hero's welcome. They parted for the policeman, cheering and slapping him on the back and shaking hands with him as he went. It was the first time he had ever been back to the ship since jumping overboard to save Joseph's father, and Joseph and his family strained to get a good look at him over the heads of the other passengers. Joseph's mother cried and put a hand to her mouth, and Joseph felt a surge of affection for the policeman. It was the man who had saved his father's life. The policeman seemed generally flattered and surprised by all the attention. He was a short, stocky man with olive skin, a wide face, and a thick mustache. He wore blue pants, a gray shirt, and epaulets on the shoulders, and matching gray beret. Around his waist was a leather belt with a nightstick and a holster hanging from it. His name, as they told, was Mariano Padron. Captain Schroeder arrived to thank Officer Padron on behalf of the passengers and the crew. Joseph felt a ripple of tension spread throughout the room. Joseph had seen the captain less and less on the hot days of waiting at anchors dragged on, but he wasn't the only passenger who had noticed. But they were there to celebrate Officer Padron, not badger the captain about why they were still on the ship. The mood had become happy again when the policeman presented with a gift of 150 Reichsmarks that had been collected from grateful passengers. Officer Padron was stunned, and so was Joseph. 150 Reichsmarks, that's German money, was a lot of money, especially for people who might need the money later on to pay for visas and entrance fees. Officer Padron tried to refuse the money, but the passengers wouldn't hear of it. "I was just doing my job," Officer Padron told the audience through a translator. "But I will never forget this. I will never forget any of you. Thank you." The passengers applauded again, and while many of them turned their attention to the captain to ask for a status report, Joseph and his mother and sister pushed forward to talk to the policeman. Officer Padron's eyes lit up at the sight of Joseph's mother. He said something in Spanish, and the passenger, who had spoken for him in front of the crowd, smiled and translated his words. "Senora, your father was a thief?" Joseph's mother frowned. "A thief? My father? No, I don't understand." "Your father, he must have been a thief," Officer Padron said through a translator, "because he stole the stars from the sky and put them in the Senora's eyes." Joseph finally understood. It was some kind of compliment about how pretty she was. Her mother smiled politely but impatiently. "Officer Padron, what about my husband?" she asked. "Is he all right? They won't let me go ashore and see him." The policeman took off his hat. "I am so sorry, so very sorry, Senora Ladau. Yes, your husband is alive," he said through the interpreter. "He is in the hospital. He has been..." Officer Padron said something more, but the translator frowned. It was beyond his limited Spanish. Officer Padron could see his confusion, and he pantomimed what he meant by turning his wrists upside down, closing his eyes, and lolling his head back like he was asleep. "Sedated," Mama said. There was pain in her voice. Joseph knew she blamed herself. The whole reason her husband was gone was because she had been sedated and unable to stop him. Officer Padron nodded. "It's not good," he said through the interpreter, "but he will still live." Joseph's mother took both of the policemen's hands into her own and kissed them. Thank you, Officer Padron. She spoke in German, but the policeman seemed to understand. He blushed and nodded. Then he spied Ruthie half hidden behind her mother's skirt and knelt down to her. He put his policeman's beret on her head and said something in Spanish, and she smiled. He says, "You're the policewoman now," the translator said. "He will be the criminal. You must catch him." Aww. Officer Padron led Ruthie on a merry chase around the room, Ruthie squealing. Joseph's mother laughed through a sob. It was the first time Joseph had heard her laugh or had seen her smile in months. Officer Padron let Ruthie catch him, and he plucked the hat off Ruthie's head and put it on Joseph's head, speaking in Spanish again. He says it's your turn, the translator said. Oh, no, Joseph said. He waved a hand to make sure the policeman understood. He wasn't in the mood for fun and games. Besides, he was too old for that kind of thing. Officer Padron tapped Joseph's back with the back of his hand, urging him to play. He says he is the passenger, the translator said. Officer Padron raised himself in a mock anger and spoke in Spanish. You, Senor Policeman, the translator said. When will we leave the ship? The happy moon suddenly disappeared. Joseph and his family and the translator all looked at each other awkwardly. Officer Padron had only meant to mimic what everyone asked him all the time, but the question made Joseph sag. It felt like they were never going to get off the ship. Officer Padron realized his mistake immediately and looked anguished at having brought it up. He nodded in deep sympathy, but then in unison, he and Joseph spoke the answer that all the Cuban guards always gave. Mañana. And mañana, tomorrow, I will see you for the next 3 chapters. I miss you all. Bye.